Oh my god, hi guys, I am officially back in business. Hello and welcome to my channel again. I know I lied, straight up lied, I'm sorry, and said that I would be back in May. I've been a little busy since May, and I haven't really been able to sit down and make a video. So I'm making that up to you guys with this video, which was a highly requested case, and I'm sure it's kind of going to be probably one of the more popular cases that I cover. It's pretty well known in the true crime community because it is literally insane, but somebody requested this to me, and you know, when I first read like the little Wikipedia summary headline, whatever, I knew I had to film this. So today's case is going to be on John Charles Thomas Price, and if you don't know who that is, it's probably because the killer in this case got way more notoriety than the murder victim, and the murderer in this case is Katherine Knight. So I'm kind of doing this case in a little different fashion than I normally would, and I think that that's really important because this crime was just so graphic that I think it's super important that we look at the murderer's life and see kind of not necessarily where things went wrong, but where things went wrong and kind of how, you know, her childhood impacted the result of this crime. I think it's really interesting, coming from someone who enjoys true crime, to look at the life that someone had before they decided to start killing and, you know, to kind of see where things went a little awry. So without further ado, let's get into the case of John Charles Thomas Price. So the first thing that I wanted to cover, obviously in all my cases I like to do a little bit of background info on the key characters in the story, and so the first person I'm going to cover is Katherine Knight herself. So Katherine was born in Tenterfield, New South Wales, Australia on October 24th, 1955. Her home life was described as dysfunctional and poor for a child to grow up in. Before Katherine was even born, her mother began an affair with her then husband's friend. And since they lived in a very small community of Tenterfield, which I don't really know the population, but I could display it here, it's obviously a very small town, and so in small towns like this, you know, gossip and rumors and all that travel so fast, and so in this small community, that's exactly what happened. Everyone found out about Katherine's mother's scandal, and so they felt like they were forced to leave the community that they had lived in their whole lives because everyone was talking about them and they didn't want to live in a place where that was going on. And so they up and left their whole family. So Katherine's mother fled the town along with her then boyfriend, Ken, the one that she cheated on her husband with. She left all of her kids with her old husband and just up and left. So after Ken and Katherine had moved, they decided that they wanted to have their own child, and so they did. They had a child, and I don't have the name, but this is Katherine's older sister in like the lineup of the family. So some things to know about Ken Knight, which is Katherine's dad, is that he was an alcoholic and a very, very abusive man. He would get very violent when he drank, and in his home, he would openly and freely use violence all the time to get things that he wanted, and this included sex from his wife, where he would, if, you know, she didn't consent to sex, he would rape her and force her to have sex. And this could occur anywhere from 1 to up to 10 times a day. So eventually, Ken Knight and Katherine's mother had their child, Katherine. They had another one, and so obviously the violence in the home didn't stop, and so when Katherine was growing up, she was exposed to all of the violence that her father would do to her mother, which included the beatings, the rapings, and sometimes would, you know, occur in front of the children. So Katherine and her sister were not shy to violence at all, and this was kind of just something that they had normalized in their childhood because it had been around so frequently. As a child, people described young Katherine as having a horrible temper, and they also described her as being a shy girl, which I think is kind of an interesting combination because usually shy girls are super nice and, you know, they want people to come up and talk to them, but it seemed like Katherine was super shy, and then when people did approach her, she would just lash out and was very violent, which is very weird characteristics to have. Something else that Katherine never really received a lot of in her childhood was her mother's attention, so that's something that she drastically craved as she was growing up. She would do a lot of things just to get her mom's attention, which I'm assuming is kind of where these lashings out, you know, started from, because to her, if she used violence, that would kind of get attention because violence is the currency of this family, and I feel like her childhood really impacted her in that way, which explains why she was so violent, you know, as she was growing up, because it's just what was normal to her. So throughout Katherine's childhood, she says that she was sexually assaulted multiple times by family members up until the age of 11 years old. So she says that at 11 years old, that's when it stopped. So the sexual assaults started from, you know, a younger age to 11. Psychologists believe that this was a huge part of why she developed a lack of emotions. And this is kind of a little psychological dive into Catherine's brain, so stay with me for a second. Psychologists believe that due to the abuse that she suffered at home, she was getting, abused in her house, Katherine may have disassociated in order to deal with the life that she was living. It was too painful for her to actually live it, and so, it was almost easier if she didn't have to live it and she could kind of just disassociate, which basically means, I think, I'm not really a huge I don't really understand dissociation all that much myself, but I think it is a coping mechanism that people use when faced with traumatic experiences and moments in their life. So due to her disassociating at such a young age, this is when a lot of people will start to develop emotions. So, when you're younger, you learn how to love someone else, you learn how to be happy and sad, and you learn how to read other people's emotions. But due to Catherine's disassociation at that age of when it was really important to learn emotions and start, getting your own emotions, she wasn't there for that. She had disassociated. And so psychologists believe that because of that disassociation, she lacked emotions even when growing up, and so she never really had her own to begin with. So as Katherine grew up, she obviously attended all of her schools, and I couldn't find too much information on the schooling situation with her, but I read that she was all over an okay student. She wasn't too great, she wasn't too bad. Katherine attended Muswell Brook High School, and people said that she was perceived there as a loner and frequently would bully other students. At age 15, Katherine ended up completely leaving high school and just ditching it altogether. And she was actually unable to read or write when she left school, which I don't even know how that's possible, that a school can just let you leave without knowing the ability to read or write, but Katherine didn't have that. I also was really confused by that because some sources said that she was really good in school, but how can you be good in school if you can't read or write, which is the basis of school? So I was a little confused on that, so take that information with a grain of salt, but they said that she couldn't read or write when she left school. And she began to work as a cutter in a clothing factory, which I'm just assuming is like, they cut the clothes, so she already started off a job with sharp objects, which you'll see why that was very concerning later in the story. So after about a year of working as a cutter at this store, she decided that it was no longer for her and she didn't really enjoy it anymore, and so she wanted to move up to something else. She became a butcher, and at this shop, her job was to cut up the animals, and she specifically was cutting offal, which I had to look that up because what is offal? It is animal organs. And so her job was to literally slaughter animals and then cut them up, harvesting their organs and meat to be sold at this butcher shop. So when I was researching that, a lot of foreshadowing is occurring in this case if you know the ending, but stay with me. That is very concerning, and that actually is very important when we get to later in the story. So just remember, she started off as a butcher, and that was kind of her job throughout her whole life. But she described this job as her dream job, being a butcher shop cutter, so that was something that she really, really enjoyed. So a lot of other people that worked in the stores with Katherine said that she would cut the animals' arteries and watch them slowly bleed out, hearing their screams, and it seemed like she enjoyed this. And I remember I watched the documentary on this, and they said that Katherine really enjoyed watching other people look in horror at what she was doing. She really enjoyed that shock factor of what she was doing by just doing the most shocking things, cutting open animals' arteries and just watching them slowly bleed out to see the horror in other people's eyes. So after she was promoted at her store, she was given her own set of butcher knives to keep at her house. She kept these with her at all times, and she actually had them hanging above her bed, and this was a trend that continued up until her incarceration. She would hang them above her bed, and when people would ask, what's that? She would say that she wanted them there in case she ever needed them. So now in 1973, Katherine Knight met a man named David Kellett. So now we're going to kind of talk about her relationships that she had. She does have a couple actually, and so we're going to kind of go into each one, and you're going to hear some very interesting things about Katherine. So after she had met David Kellett, they became drinking buddies and eventually started to date. An interesting fact I found about their relationship is that when he needed someone to back him up, so if he ever got in a bar fight or something, Katherine was right there to defend him, using her own fists if she had to. She was a very violent person, something that we saw in her childhood, which continued into her adult life, and it's something that she used to actually defend the people that she was trying to date, which I thought was kind of interesting. At first, it almost seemed like she was really supportive and tried to help him as much as she could. So the couple kind of had a whirlwind romance, and within the year was actually married in 1974. For the wedding, David has talked to his family about this moment, and he said that something really interesting happened. Barbara, who is Katherine's mother, actually pulled him aside a little bit before the wedding and gave him a warning about her daughter and said, and this quote is David Kellett talking about Barbara, the mother. She said, "The old girl," implying Knight's mother, "said to me to watch out. You better watch this one or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're fucked. And that was her mother talking. She told me she's got something loose. She's got a screw loose somewhere. On the night that Katherine and David were wed, Katherine actually attempted to strangle him, and David had woken up to find her hands literally around his neck. You know, when he woke up and he was like, what's going on? And she said that on her parents' wedding night, they had sex 5 times, and so since David and her had only had sex 3 times, she thought that it was supposed to be 5 times on your wedding night, and so she strangled him because she was upset. So obviously, if this was happening on their wedding night, you can assume that the marriage itself was very volatile and violent the whole time. People described Katherine as being very moody, and one second she might be singing around the house and really happy with David, and the next minute she would be in a blind rage attacking on David. So in 1976, Katherine and David had welcomed their first child into this world, a baby girl. At first, you know, they tried to work things out. David would try to stay with Katherine even though she was abusive at home, but eventually it just got too much, and so in 1976, the same year that his daughter was born, he left the family. He left the daughter with Katherine and he fled because he couldn't deal with the abuse anymore that he was suffering at home. This sent Katherine into some sort of psychotic state. And the next day, neighbors had seen her violently throwing around the baby's carriage, pushing it aggressively from side to side down the road where the baby was inside the carriage, getting thrown around inside of it. Obviously, this was super concerning as a parent cannot be abusing their child, and so the police were called on Katherine and she was sent to St. Elmo's Hospital in Tamsworth to be treated as obviously she needed some help. So at this hospital, she was then diagnosed with postnatal depression, which is something that women do experience, and it's basically a depression brought about by, you know, right after giving birth. So a few weeks after her hospitalization had begun, it had just as soon ended, and they gave her medicine and they thought that, you know, she was good to go, I guess, and so they released her back into the world and she got custody of her daughter again, which I don't really understand how that works, but I guess if they thought that she was mentally well again, that she should have her daughter back, so that was their thought process. However, literally days after being released, Katherine then placed her now 2-month-old daughter, Melissa, on a set of active train tracks where a train would be pulling up soon. So she had walked to a train that she knew would be coming in the next few minutes and placed her baby on the tracks and just simply walked away. After dropping off her baby, she had somehow found an axe. I believe she was rummaging through a neighbor's shed or something near the train tracks, and she went into the town that she lived in and threatened to start hurting and killing people, anyone that she came across. So, you know, while she had gone to the town, she left her baby by the tracks, and thankfully, a man, I think he was homeless, had stumbled upon the baby in the tracks, and, you know, just a few minutes before the train was going to come and kill this child, he had come by and he had picked up the baby and brought him to the local hospital where they would make sure the baby was okay, and the police would get called and they would sort out like who this baby's was and why it was on the tracks in the first place. So obviously Katherine was going into town and she was attacking people, so the police were again called on her and they figured out what she had done to her baby because they realized it was her again, and they sent her back to St. Elmo's Hospital where she had gone the first time because they thought, well, you know, she's clearly not good if she's doing the exact same thing again. However, the next day, Katherine was able to somehow sign herself out of the hospital and say that she was better and that she was able to go, which I didn't think was even possible, considering that she was hospitalized because she was trying to kill her baby. I don't think you can just sign yourself out, but somehow in the 70s that was okay, and so she was able to sign herself out. And literally in my notes, how does this happen? A woman who just attempted murder on her child was allowed to sign herself out of a mental hospital? Insane, which is exactly how I feel while reading this case. So a few days following this incident of attempted murder on her 2-month-old daughter, Katherine had attacked a woman in her town, taken her hostage, and forced her to drive her to Queensland, which I'm not sure how far away, but I'm pretty sure that's a couple hours away from where she lived, so she could find her ex Colette's mother because he wanted to kill her to get attention from David. However, on this, hostage journey, the woman that Katherine had taken captive had somehow managed to convince Katherine to bring her to a service station, and at the service station, she was thankfully able to escape. So now Katherine was just sitting in the car alone with a knife. But obviously, this wasn't a great move because now Katherine had a knife and she was just sitting in the car. So she got out of that car, walked into a nearby town, and found a child and took him hostage because I guess to her, she was just trying to get as much attention as she could. But police were thankfully able to disarm Katherine and save the boy. So no one was severely harmed or killed during this, stint again. So now this is the third, I guess, attempted murder, attacking spree that she had gone on in like a week, because she keeps getting released from the hospital, sent back, released from the hospital, sent back in like the span of 2 weeks. So obviously something was going on. But again, they sent her right back to the mental hospital, which I just can't believe, because if it didn't work the first 2 times, maybe you should try something new this time. Not really sure, but maybe that is something to look into. But they did end up sending her to a new hospital, so at least it wasn't the exact same one. So after David had heard that his ex-wife, I'm not really sure what the relationship was at this point, if it was like divorced or not, but Katherine, he heard that she was in a mental institution, and so he somehow felt obliged to move back to where they lived, pick her up, and, take care of her as best he could, and take care of her child. And I think that was the thing that really made him want to move back, was his daughter. He didn't want to leave her with Katherine, because he obviously had now just started to hear about all the atrocities that she was doing. And so he thought that if he moved back, he could try to appease her and make sure that she wouldn't attack their children anymore. And so I guess this was his goal when he wanted to move back. And so on August 9th of 1976, a few months following the attacks in May, Katherine was released from the hospital into the custody of David and his mother. So then the family moved to Ipswich, all of them, David, Katherine, and the mother. And so this was a city close to Brisbane, if you know where that is, because this case does take place in Australia. She somehow managed to get another job despite her lengthy history of past crimes, and crimes specifically using a knife especially, like how would you get a butcher shop job? But she did. She found another butcher shop job, and this was a meat packing job at Dinmore Meatworks. So now David and Katherine were, living together. I think the abuse was definitely continued into this. I don't think it was just ever going to stop with Katherine, but David was living with her to protect their baby. During this time, I guess one of David's sisters had come up to visit the family, and so the sister had come one weekend to visit. And during this weekend, while she was getting ready in her own room, she heard screams coming from downstairs, and this sounded like a baby crying very loudly. And babies cry, obviously, but she said that it was just really eerie and concerning. And so she walked downstairs, and what she saw was Katherine was holding their baby underneath a faucet, spewing hot water on top of its head. She was freaked out by this, and she left because she didn't know what to do. She didn't, I think she had heard a little bit of Katherine's volatility, and so she didn't want to jump in and, potentially get hurt herself, and so she left the baby there with Katherine. And so she went to go find her brother and say, listen, like, what the hell is going on with your wife? Like, why is she drowning the baby, burning the baby? And he said, I understand that you're concerned, but please don't say anything to her, because I'm worried she will kill us, me or you or both of us, if you say anything. Clearly tension was really high in the house at this point, and there was fear of potentially losing their life if they spoke up to Katherine. So Katherine had a really strong power dynamic and ruled with fear in this house. However, in 1984, so this was a couple years after Katherine's release and after she had moved back in with the family from the psychiatric hospital, the couple had another daughter named Natasha. So there are a couple accounts of like things that Katherine had done to abuse David in the family, and so I'm just going to read one really significant one, but just keep in mind there were a lot of other ones. I'm just kind of noting like the big ones that either required hospital treatment or like it was just so obvious what was going on that you couldn't really avoid it. So Katherine had taken a frying pan and smacked it across David's face. The hit was so strong that it fractured a chunk of his skull, and he quickly went to their neighbor's house because he wanted to seek treatment. The police were called by the neighbors because they wanted to see what was going on. Domestic violence is very serious, and, something like this could eventually lead to something more sinister and more violent if it's not addressed, earlier on. However, Katherine had managed to talk David down from the police and pressing charges, so he wouldn't talk to the police at all, and he said, I'm not going to press charges on my wife, like, sorry, like, you're wasting your time, you can leave, don't worry about it. And so they left. They continued to live together, actually, after this incident, which is just crazy to me that, a skull fracture is very serious. That had to be a really strong hit from a frying pan to dent your head that much, and the fact that he was just willing to still live with her is actually kind of insane, but he did. So after this incident and after the birth of their second daughter, Katherine actually, surprisingly enough, decided that she no longer wanted in this relationship, and so she left David. And she temporarily moved back into Aberdeen with her parents. and then she eventually got her own place. So after working for a little while, she had actually sustained a really bad injury at her work, and this harmed her back, and so because of this, she was allowed to quit her job and collect disability because she was injured. The government had also given her a place to live, which was rent-free, so now she didn't have rent to pay, and she had a disability check, so a job, not really, but she was getting money. She didn't have to pay rent, so, you know, she had enough money, I guess, to take care of herself and her 2 children at this point. So over the next 10 years, Katherine had kind of entered a couple other serious relationships with men, none as long as David Collette, but, you know, there were a couple in this time frame, which is kind of crazy that she keeps getting into relationships, considering she doesn't really seem like a charming woman, but somehow people were okay with that. So the first relationship that she entered was with a man named David Saunders, which lasted several years. He describes their relationship as being really, really good at first, and having a honeymoon period until eventually this ran out and the abuse of Katherine took over yet again. In one account, she had swung at him with a hot iron, which actually did hit him in the face, the hot iron part, and left like the burn marks of an iron on the side of his cheek for weeks. And it took weeks and weeks to heal, so people had seen that on his face. And that's not really like a accident that you can just say like, oh, I fell down the stairs. Like, that's a hot iron to your face. That's not really like something you can just move past. A little later in the relationship, actually, David had cheated on Katherine as he could not take this constant abuse. When Katherine found out about the cheating that David had done, she grabbed his dog, took one of her butcher knives, while David was watching, and slit the dog's throat in front of him, and just put the dog down and watched as David was horrified as his girlfriend had just slit his dog's throat right in front of him. After this, he obviously tried to leave her yet again, but somehow, I guess her manipulation skills were really good. I'm sure she, you know, had a lot of practice when she was younger, seeing how her parents interacted, and so she knew how to keep a man involved and keep a man interested in her manipulative tactics. So together, they actually did have a daughter together. However, you know, the violence just continued to keep getting worse in their relationship. And so eventually, David did try to escape again, and he was actually successful, and he ended up moving as far away as he could to Newcastle to just get away from Katherine and her manipulative lies. However, I believe he did also leave his daughter with her, so now she had 3 children to look after. In 1997, Katherine started dating a new man named John Chillingworth, who fathered another child to Katherine, and this was actually a boy named Eric, so this was her first son. However, this relationship was cut short as Katherine simultaneously was having an affair with a man named John Price. After the relationship with John Chillingworth had been broken off because Katherine decided that she wanted John Price more, John had actually asked her to move in with him, and so they moved in together. And at this point, he was aware of her violent temper, but I don't think it was too severe, as he said. He told family members that he was aware of it, but he didn't really care of the severity of it, and he, I guess, didn't think it would go super bad, or he just didn't care. At the beginning of their relationship, everything was really good. Katherine's children really liked him, and his children, because he had his own set, really liked her. So it seemed like this was a really good pairing, as both groups of kids liked each other and they liked the parents. However, as time went on, as all relationships with Katherine do, the violence began to set in. In one story, John's daughter was driving in the car with her, and when she saw a dog trying to cross the street, instead of, you know, trying to stop or, you know, slow down as much as she could, she actually sped up and swerved into the other lane to hit the dog, killing it, and drive away. And, you know, his daughter was really concerned by this because that's just not normal human behavior, to go after and try to intentionally kill animals, especially a dog. And so the daughter, I'm sure probably told her father, but he probably was like, oh, you're just seeing things, like she definitely didn't do that, like it was definitely an accident she probably didn't see. And so he made excuses for her to keep the children kind of okay with her. And so in 1998, they had several arguments over the fact that John just didn't really want to marry Katherine. He kind of wanted to keep her as his girlfriend, but not marry her. And this really, really, really upset Katherine. She didn't understand why he wouldn't want to marry her, and so she reacted in the only way that Katherine knows how to, which is by trying to ruin his life. And so in order to get back at him, she had gone through his stuff and videotaped first aid kits that he had allegedly stole from his workplace, because I believe he worked as a miner. She had sent these videos to his boss. So videos of allegedly stolen first aid kits, which she said in the video, like, here are like some first aid kits that I saw were stolen, like I think my husband did this, like they're at my house. When the man saw that John had taken some first aid kits from his place of work, this was technically stealing, even though these first aid kits were out of date, and I think John just wanted them to have for his own family because maybe they needed some first aid kits. However, it was technically stealing, and so John's employer was forced to fire him, even though he had never done anything wrong in his 17 years of working there. That night that he had found out what she did, he immediately kicked her out and said, like, leave, get out of my house, like, I can't look at you, like, I'm so upset with what you do, like, how could you do this to me, like, this isn't a normal thing to do to someone. However, only a few months later, the relationship had restarted, except this time, he did not let her move back in with him, and so they were still together, but they were not living together, and I think that was what he thought was the root of their problems, that, oh, if we don't live together, like, it should be fine, like, we just need space. So that was his fear. However, the fighting between them got so bad that when John's friends were hanging out with him and Katherine, they said that it was horrendous, like, they literally couldn't do it, and so in the future, if they knew that Katherine was going somewhere, they were not gonna go. And so, some basic information on John Price. I couldn't find all that much. I really did try to dig and find, like, things that I could tell you guys about him. He was born on April 4th, 1955. His occupation was a miner, like I said, so he was mining in the, like, mining for coal or things like that. I don't know what he was specifically mining for, but, you know, like a coal miner, that type of a vibe. And, you know, I couldn't find all that much, but people did really describe him as being a really kind and fun guy. I saw some clips in a documentary that I watched on this case, where his daughters were just saying, like, he was a really good guy, and he was just a really good father to them, and he always cared about them, and he always put them first, and he tried to do what was best for them, but at the end of the day, he still, you know, did want a relationship, and so I guess he overlooked these red flags with Katherine Knight. So that is kind of the backstory on how these two people ended up meeting, and that'll take us to the rest of the story, and you know, what happens when you don't heed warning signs of domestic violence in relationships. So in February of the year 2000, Katherine and John had gotten into a particularly bad and brutal fight. This was after 5 or so years of them dating. During this fight, Katherine Knight had gotten a kitchen knife and used it to stab John Price in the chest. Like, literally stab him. The wound, thankfully, was mostly superficial, and so right after this, he was able to kick Katherine out of the house and go get the help that he needed to patch up his now stab wound. A few weeks later, on the 29th of February, John had headed over to the courthouse to pick up a restraining order from his now ex, Katherine. He was ready, I think, to finally distance himself from Katherine because I think he realized, like, if he didn't do this now, she would kill him. Like, he wouldn't make it out of this relationship alive. When John had gone to work later that day after getting his restraining order, he told a few of his coworkers that if he didn't return the next day, that Katherine has killed him. So his coworkers desperately tried to convince him, like, don't go back to your house, like, it's not safe, like, it doesn't matter, like, you know, leave her there, like, if you go back, she might try to kill you, like, you need to know, like, that is a very real possibility. He had his kids all at home, and so he feared that if he didn't go home, Katherine would kill his children, and so he was afraid that she would do harm to them, and so, you know, being the father that he was, he wanted to go protect his kids, even if it meant putting himself at risk. So when he arrived home, he had learned that his children were sent away by Katherine to a sleepover at a neighbor's house. So he knew that his children were safe, and he, you know, was able to be a little more relaxed after that. So after learning that his children were safe, he wanted to go, you know, chill a little bit, not at the house that he lived in. And so he went to a neighbor's home nearby and spent time with them until 11 p.m. when he finally returned home and went to sleep. So when he got home, he was surprised, and he noticed before, you know, he went to sleep, he was surprised that Katherine was not home yet. So he was surprised when he got home and saw that Katherine wasn't home. However, during that day, Katherine had a bit of her own agenda going on. She had gone out and purchased some black lingerie and filmed her children in various places of the house. And what I mean by that is, I guess she had like a video camera and she was just filming her children and saying things about the children, and when people recovered this video later, they said it was almost like a will. That she was saying like what she wants for the kids, what she wants to give to the kids, like a last will and testament sort of thing on this video. So eventually Katherine had turned up back at their house, and I don't think they still live together, but I think she just showed up at this house. And she took a shower and woke up John, and the two actually ended up having sex before they both fell asleep together. At around 6 a.m. of the next day, the neighbors, which John had been, you know, staying with earlier that day until around 11, noticed that his car was still in the driveway, and I thought that was super unusual because he has work and he probably wouldn't want to be, you know, at the house with Katherine. I think Katherine lived with the children in this house, so this might have, I think this was her house, but he had just ended up sleeping there. I'm not 1,000% sure. It was kind of confusing, like, whose house was whose, but, you know, who was living with who, but At this point, it was strange that his car would still be there at 6 a.m. When John didn't arrive at work the next day, his friend said this was really strange because literally the day before he was saying, if I didn't turn up to work, like something horrible has happened, like find out what's happened. His neighbors had called the police after they had gone over to the house and tried knocking on the doors, and when they did knock on the door, they looked in and they saw blood sprayed on the wall, and they knew that this was not a good sign. And so they called the police and were like, please come, like something is not right. So when the police got there, they attempted to knock on the door, however, no one answered, and so they decided it would be best to kick down the door and enter themselves because there was blood, so they had probable cause to suspect that something bad had happened. I want to give a little warning before I go into the rest of this case. This is going to be a little graphic, so if you guys are not into the graphicness of cases, you can skip to the timestamp. I'll try to put one here if I remember, or just skip a little ahead and I'll probably be done talking about it, but it is going to get a little graphic. So if you guys want to hear that, continue. If not, totally get it. All up to you. Okay. So when the police had entered the house, the first thing that they had saw was a meat hook was from the ceiling, and on that hook was the completely skinned body of John Price. And he was skinned so well, I guess is the word, that his body was completely recognized. His head, like his face was still on there, the scalp, his whole body was just skinned on this hook, and it looked like him, but it didn't. I don't think there's pictures anywhere. I pray there's no pictures anywhere. No one should ever have to see that. I can't imagine, like I'm getting literal like chills, goosebumps thinking about that alone. And when they continued to walk in the house, they saw Katherine laying on the floor, and they couldn't tell if she was alive or dead, but when they did go up to her, they did see she had breath, and they decided that it was a coma, and they noticed some pills next to her, so they think it was an overdose that caused a coma. So Katherine was obviously taken to the hospital where she was recovered, where she did recover over the course of the next 3 or 4 days, and she had to be questioned. However, before Katherine had awoken and was questioned, police knew that they could get some information from this crime scene, and so they brought in forensic techs to kind of tell them about the blood splatter and just try to figure out what things had happened here. And they also continued to go into the rest of the house where even more horrors were waiting for them. So according to how the blood splatter and drops were sprayed around the house, police had a really good idea of what happened to John the day that he was killed without even talking to her. So they think Katherine must have started the attack on the couch by stabbing John. This woke him up and sent him in a panic, and he raced to the nearest door he could escape, which explains why there was some blood on the doorknob and on the wall near the door where they could see. He had even managed to unlock the front door, and they believe he ran out just a little bit, but sadly, because he had been stabbed and was losing blood, he probably collapsed, and Katherine was able to drag him in as he was still super weak now. They believe that Katherine had left him on the floor to bleed out, as this was a super big wound and a serious wound. Throughout the autopsy of the body, it was noted that he had been stabbed over 37 times, and many of the wounds have gone completely through his body, popping out on the other side. And this must have taken an excessive amount of force to complete. I'm not sure if, there was one initial stab wound and then he tried to run, or she was just literally stabbing him the entire time, and then, he tried to get up and run away. But he was stabbed a total of 37 times. And so following his death, a horrific set of actions occurred that would make this case known all over the world and would give her the name the female Hannibal Lector. The police had first walked in and saw his entire skinned body hanging on that meat hook. And so I guess their first thought was, where's the rest of him? And so as they moved into the house, they noticed that an entire feast was set up with all types of food. Specifically, there was dinner, which included baked potato, pumpkin, beetroot, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash, and gravy. It was a whole entire meal. And, there was also pieces of meat that they weren't sure what that was. And so as they continued to go through, they noticed pieces of his mangled body they found, I guess, the rest of his mangled body, the interior meat. It's weird even calling it that, but the meat of his body, I guess. And they noticed that chunks had been taken out of it, and they even noticed that some were still in the kitchen being cooked. They had also gone over the table and seen that each plate that was set up had a name tag for the children, and when they looked at the food, John's body parts were mixed in with the food at this dinner, and it was like one big feast, but the meat was all John. And when they actually noticed a big pot of soup, or what they assume was soup, and when they opened it, they found John's decapitated head floating in there. When the detectives continued to go outside of the house now, they noticed that there was a whole meal thrown outside onto the ground. And when they brought that in for testing, it was confirmed to be a half-eaten piece of John's body. So what is assumed is that Katherine tried to eat her own food, but she couldn't do it. And so she threw it out onto the lawn. So the food, when they had found it, was all still relatively warm, so it means that she was probably cooking up until very recently. And when they found his body, they noticed that it was kind of hunched over, or the body, meaning the interior, like muscles and stuff like that, were hunched over holding a bottle of soda. A note was also found next to his body, which accused him of abusing their children. However, these accusations were proved to be baseless when they interviewed the children afterwards, and no one in the family knew about these. So it seems like Katherine was just kind of finding an excuse, being like, oh, he abused the children, like he deserves all of this, which, what are you even talking? Like, it didn't make sense. The detectives knew that this was pretty much BS. And so after the murder had taken place, they know that she had gone to the bank and that she had withdrawn $1,000 from his account, which is really important because it shows that she was not in like this insane state that she may claim during the questioning, which she did end up claiming. During the questioning, she said that I believe she said she did do it. However, she was not guilty by reason of insanity because she was not in the right state of mind during this. However, this is a really important piece of evidence that people cite and say, well, actually, she withdrew $1,000, so clearly she was thinking about, you know, the after, like, how am I going to get away? Like, I need money to do that in order to leave and escape so they don't catch me. So clearly she was thinking straight during this whole horrendous attack. So now was the trial. Originally, Katherine tried to receive a plea for manslaughter, but the detectives rejected this because there was so much evidence to prove that this was not, and this wasn't just like a murder, like she had stabbed him. She had stabbed him, skinned him, cut him up, and tried to feed him to their children. This was not just manslaughter, and so she tried to plead it down because I think she knew there was way too much evidence for her to get off completely not guilty, but she thought if she did manslaughter, it might be a little better. She was arraigned on March 2nd of 2001, but the state kept getting pushed back due to her mental health problems, and so the new start date was on the 15th of October 2001. So she was going to plead not guilty to this crime because they didn't take the manslaughter plea. She was ready to do not guilty, and so a trial was to commence. And so during the jury selection, the 60 potential jurors were given the option to opt out of hearing this case because of the such graphic details and pictures they were going to get shown. I, in my research, have never heard of something like that, where the crime was so graphic and horrendous that they were like, you know what, we understand that this is really bad, so you guys don't have to hear this if you don't want to. And actually 5 out of the 60 potential jurors did leave the courtroom because they just, you know, heard some details of the case and did not want to hear the rest of it, and so they left. So I've never heard of that, and I just thought that was a really, really interesting fact about this case. So however, the day after the jury had been selected, so now they had the jurors that were needed, the judge was alerted that Katherine had changed her plea to guilty. And so she did change her plea to guilty, so she was going to go away for the murder because she was admitting to it. However, I think it's interesting to hear what defense strategy they would have gone with. And so a defense strategy that the lawyers were kind of working on was they wanted to say that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing amnesia and dissociation during the events of the murder. Psychiatrists also believed that she had an undiagnosed case of borderline personality disorder. So Katherine had a slew of mental health issues during the crime and after. You know, there's a lot of debate whether or not she was insane during the crime. You know, people think that she wasn't, and they cite the $1,000 taken out as one of the reasons why not, and people think that she was because how can someone do that sane? Like, how does that even happen? Like, I don't know. So it's up to you guys what you think about this case. So despite pleading guilty, she has never ever said why she did this. And so at her sentence and hearing, the crimes had to be read out loud. And during this time, Katherine became hysterical and had to be exited out of the courtroom because I think she couldn't keep it together hearing what she had done. So on November 8th, she was sentenced, and the judge believed that due to the brutality of this crime, Katherine needed a very severe punishment of life imprisonment to be never let out because she was so deadly. In June 2006, Katherine tried to appeal this life sentence, but was rejected due to the horrendousness of the crime. The justice had written, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." And to this day, Katherine still remains in this prison, alive. So this completes the murder of John Price. So I hope you guys found this case really interesting. I know I did. It was probably the most graphic and brutal case I've covered in context of like one singular murder. it was crazy to read about, and the more that I read about it, the sicker I got, but it was really interesting, so thank you for the suggestion. I had not actually heard of this case before, or looked into it, so it was a really interesting one to do. So thank you guys, and I look forward to making another video for you next week. Guys, follow me on my Twitter, Instagram, all of the above, DM me, say hi. Guys, my Twitter is lit, no one ever talks about it, but it's really a fun time, so I would really recommend that you guys go and follow me on there, and I have like 20 followers. Let's grow that number a little bit. I want to like interact with you guys, 'cause it's like really fun. So yeah, I will see you in the next video. Bye guys!